The first time Clara Weston realized she might be falling in love with Eli Calloway was also the first time she became convinced he despised her entirely, and the bitter irony of that particular Tuesday morning in the spring of 1879 would stay with her for the rest of her long and beautiful life. She had come to the town of Harrow Creek, Texas, with nothing more than a battered carpetbag, a letter of introduction from the Reverend back in Memphis, and the stubborn belief that a woman of 22 years could start over in the wide, wind-scoured plains of the West. Her mother had passed the previous winter, her father long before that, and the small boarding house they had operated together near the Mississippi had been swallowed by debt the moment her mother drew her last breath. Clara had sold what little remained, tucked the coins into the lining of her boot for safekeeping, and purchased the cheapest westbound ticket she could find. She had not expected the West to be easy. She had expected it to be hers. Harrow Creek was the kind of town that looked, at first glance, as though it had been dropped from a great height and had never quite recovered from the landing. The main street was rutted deep from wagon wheels and spring rains. The buildings leaned against one another like tired old men at the end of a long day's work. There was a general store run by a broad-shouldered woman named Miss Purcell who wore her gray hair in a tight bun and looked at new arrivals as though she were calculating whether they would make it through a single winter. There was a saloon, a smithy, a small church whose whitewashed boards had gone the color of old teeth, and a livery stable that smelled powerfully of horse and hay, and something that Clara chose not to identify more precisely. She had secured a room above me's general store and a position helping me with accounts and inventory. It was not glamorous work. The ledgers were a disaster of crossed-out figures and ink blots, and the inventory had apparently last been conducted sometime around the presidency of Ulysses Grant. But Clara had a precise mind and steady hands, and she set about putting things in order with the quiet determination that had carried her this far west. It was on her third day in Harrow Creek that she first saw Eli Calloway. He came into the store just as the afternoon light was turning gold and lazy, filtering through the dusty front window and catching the motes in the air. He was tall, somewhere near 6 feet, with the kind of build that comes from genuine labor rather than show. His dark hair curled slightly at his collar beneath the brim of a worn brown hat. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone that made up the bluffs south of town, and eyes that were a shade of brown so warm and deep that Clara, looking up from her ledger, found she had lost her place entirely. He set a short list on the counter without a word. Me read it, nodded once, and began gathering the items. Clara watched him from beneath her lashes as he waited, hat in hand, turning the brim slowly between his fingers. He seemed utterly at ease with silence in a way that she found both striking and slightly unnerving. When me introduced her, he nodded, met Clara's eyes for exactly one moment that lasted somehow both less than a second and considerably longer than that, and said, "Ma'am." Then he paid, took his supplies, and walked out the door. "Who is that?" Clara asked, aware that her voice had come out somewhat softer than intended. Me gave her a look that suggested she was not fooling anyone. "Eli Calloway, rancher, owns about 300 acres southeast of town. Good man. Quiet." She paused. "Very quiet." He barely said a word. "That's a full conversation for Eli." Me returned to her shelves without further elaboration. Over the following weeks, Eli became a regular fixture in Clara's awareness of the world in the way that certain things do when you are not entirely certain what to do with them. He came into the store roughly twice a week. He was always polite, always brief, always paying exactly the right amount without needing change. Occasionally, he would look at her in that same brief, deep way, and occasionally Clara would catch herself doing something entirely unnecessary with her hair in the moments before he arrived, as though she had somehow developed a sense for the particular rhythm of his horse's hoofbeats on the dry street outside. She tried naturally to engage him in conversation, because silence had never been something Clara wore comfortably. "Lovely evening, isn't it, Mr. Calloway?" she said one afternoon in late April when the sky outside the window was the improbable pink of a first sunrise. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Are you a fan of spring? I find it much preferable to winter, though I suppose out here the difference is less dramatic than back east," he said, in a tone that managed to be neither agreement nor disagreement, but simply acknowledgement that sound had occurred. She tried again the following week. "Me tells me there's a dance Saturday. Will you be attending?" He looked at her for one of those long, brief moments. "No," he said. "Got work." And that was that. Clara went to the dance anyway, wearing her second-best dress, the blue one with the ivory trim that her mother had made her for her 20th birthday. The whole of Harrow Creek seemed to be there, or at least everyone except Eli Calloway, which she was absolutely not noticing. She danced with the blacksmith's apprentice, who was sweet and enthusiastic and had no sense of rhythm whatsoever. She danced with the Reverend Marsh's eldest son, who was earnest and talked exclusively about crop rotation. She laughed and clapped and ate 2 pieces of apple cake and told herself firmly that she was having a wonderful time. She was, in fact, having a reasonably good time, but there was a small persistent absence at the edge of the evening, like a word you can't quite remember, hovering just out of reach. It was me who first mentioned it, about 6 weeks after Clara's arrival, on a warm evening when they were closing up the store together, and the fireflies were just beginning to blink in the darkening grass beyond the street. "You know," me said, with the careful casualness of a woman who is saying exactly what she intends to say, "Eli Calloway doesn't come into town twice a week for supplies." Clara looked up from the lock she was fastening. "What do you mean?" "I mean that man has a storeroom that would see him through a siege. He doesn't need to come in twice a week. He came in once a month before you arrived." Clara felt something strange move through her, warm and uncertain. "He comes for something else, then." Me gave her a look. "He doesn't come for me, dear." Clara turned back to the lock, though it was already secured. "I'm sure you're mistaken," she said, but her voice had done that soft thing again. Me made a small sound that might have been a laugh and went inside. The trouble began in earnest in the second week of May. Clara had been taking her evening walk along the creek path that gave the town its name, a habit she had developed as a way of getting some air and quiet after the close work of the store. The cottonwood trees along the bank were in full leaf, and the water ran quick and clear over the smooth stones, and it was, all things considered, one of her favorite parts of the day. She had begun to notice, on these walks, signs of activity on the far side of the creek in the direction of Eli's land, the distant sound of hammering, the smell of fresh-cut lumber on the breeze. She had thought little of it at first, assuming repairs to a fence or a barn, but then Eli stopped coming into the store. Not permanently, not entirely, but the twice-weekly visits dropped to once a week, then to every 10 days. When he did come, he was clearly tired in a way that went bone-deep, the kind of weariness that settles into a man's posture and takes up residence there. He spoke even less than before, though Clara would not have thought that geometrically possible. He bought supplies and left with his eyes already somewhere else, somewhere far away from the store and from her, and Clara felt the small, warm, uncertain thing inside her begin to cool and harden into something that felt uncomfortably like hurt. She told herself she was being absurd. He was a ranching man with ranching concerns, and she was a store clerk who had read too many novels on the riverboat west, and built up a situation from a handful of polite monosyllables and a few warm glances. She threw herself into the work of the store with renewed energy. She reorganized the entire back storeroom, which had not been organized since approximately the founding of the Republic. She wrote long letters to an old school friend back in Memphis who had married a banker and now lived in a house with indoor plumbing, and she described the West with a sharp wit that made the letters entertaining and kept the loneliness at bay. She also, on one particular Thursday, made the mistake of mentioning her confusion to the only other young woman in Harrow Creek, who seemed remotely interested in discussing anything beyond livestock prices. Nora Hensley was 25, red-haired, freckled, and married to the town's deputy sheriff, a cheerful man named Tom who let Nora conduct most of their social affairs while he concentrated on keeping the peace. Nora's opinions were delivered with the force and velocity of a runaway stage and were absolutely not requested before being given. She was also, Clara had discovered, precisely the kind of friend that a woman alone in a strange place most needed. "He's ignoring me," Clara said flatly, sitting in Nora's kitchen over cups of coffee that were, as always at Nora's table, strong enough to stand the spoon in. Nora tilted her head. "Eli Calloway is ignoring you." "Yes. He used to come into the store regularly. Now he barely comes at all. When he does, he hardly looks at me. He said more words on the day we met than he has in the last 3 weeks combined." Nora was quiet for a moment, which for Nora was unusual enough to be significant. "And you want him to look at you?" "That is not the point I was making, Clara. I merely found his company pleasant when he provided it, which he has now apparently decided to stop doing for reasons entirely opaque to me." "Have you considered," Nora said, wrapping both hands around her cup and looking at Clara with the expression of someone carefully choosing their words, "that Eli Calloway might be occupied with something that has nothing to do with you?" "Of course I've considered it. I'm not a vain woman." "You're a woman who has been checking the window every time a horse comes down the street for 6 weeks. Clara opened her mouth, closed it, and settled for a dignified sip of coffee. "Tom says Eli has been doing something out on his land," Nora offered. "Working on it, hard, every day, long hours. Tom rode past the east side of the property last week and said there was fresh timber stacked taller than his horse." "Repairs," Clara said. "Maybe," Nora said, and there was something in her tone that Clara did not pursue. She should have pursued it. What Clara did instead, in the particular way of stubborn, intelligent women who have talked themselves out of the thing their heart is saying, was decide that she was done being affected by Eli Calloway's presence or absence. She was a practical woman. She had crossed half a continent on her own, reorganized a chaotic mercantile from the ground up, survived a Memphis winter on boiled turnips and pride, and she was not going to spend one more evening standing at the creek bend listening to the distant sound of hammering and wondering what it meant. She told herself this with great conviction on a Friday evening. On Saturday morning, she was at the creek bend listening to the hammering. It was louder today, closer. She could hear men's voices too, not just Eli's, though she could occasionally distinguish his from the others, lower and more deliberate, giving direction. She could see, through the cottonwood branches, the pale flicker of fresh wood and the movement of figures working in the morning light. There were at least 3 other men with him, men from town she thought, though she couldn't make out faces from this distance. And then, because the universe occasionally arranges things with a particular lack of mercy, Eli looked up from whatever he was directing and saw her standing on the creek bank. The distance was not so great, perhaps 40 yards across the water. She could see clearly enough that he saw her, that he recognized her, and that his expression shifted in a way she couldn't read from this far away. He lifted one hand briefly in something that might have been acknowledgement. Then he turned back to his work. Clara turned around and walked home. She was angry, which was at least cleaner than the hurt. Anger was useful. Anger kept you moving. She channeled it into the most thorough deep cleaning of Me's store shelves that those shelves had ever experienced. And Me watched her scrub with the expression of a woman, deciding not to ask questions and perhaps investing in a second layer of varnish. "He saw me standing at the creek and turned right back to his work," Clara said, because the anger was apparently also loosening her tongue. "Did he?" Me said. "Barely acknowledged me, just waved a hand and went right back to whatever he's building out there." "Building," Me repeated in a strange tone. "Yes, there's been construction going on out there for weeks. Tom Hensley saw timber stacked on the property." Clara attacked a particularly stubborn spot on the shelf. "I don't know why it concerns me in the slightest." Me was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful and gentle. "Clara, I've known Eli Calloway since he was 18 years old and came to this county with nothing but a horse and the clothes on his back. He worked himself half to death on Old Porter's ranch for 3 years before he saved enough to buy his own land. In all that time, I have never once seen that man put effort into something that wasn't deliberate and considered and done exactly right. He doesn't do things without a reason. Clara stopped scrubbing. She looked at me. What are you saying? Me picked up her broom. I'm saying that a man who builds something is building it for a purpose. And I'm saying that Eli Calloway has been in this store twice a week since the first day you walked through that door, which is twice a week more than he was here before, and that means something whether you want it to or not. She began sweeping with serene efficiency. But I'm just an old woman who runs a store, so what do I know? Clara stood with her cleaning cloth in her hand and felt the hard shell of her anger develop a significant crack. She did not go back to the creek that week, or the next. She told herself, giving the whole situation the rational perspective it deserved. She was also, she admitted to Nora, perhaps sulking a little. Just a little, Nora confirmed generously. The weeks of May rolled into June, and June in Harrow Creek was a creature of heat and grasshoppers and long evenings that lasted so late the daylight seemed reluctant to give up its hold on the land. Clara found herself settling into the town in ways she hadn't anticipated. She learned the name of every regular customer and most of their families. She helped me develop a new system for ordering that saved them both considerable effort. She started attending the church services, not from deep piety but from the social rhythm of it, the way it gathered the community together in the simple act of sitting in the same room and listening to the same words. It was in church, on the second Sunday of June, that she had the longest conversation with Eli Calloway she'd managed to date. He came in just as the service was beginning and took the end of the pew directly behind hers, which in a church with 12 pews was either coincidence or choice. She was very aware of him behind her through the entire service, of the solid weight of his presence, of the occasional shift and settle of him against the pew. The Reverend was talking about building and tending, and the patience required of both, which Clara would later reflect was either deeply ironic or extremely providential, depending on one's view of how the universe arranges things. Afterward, standing in the white sunlight outside the church while the congregation broke into its usual post-service clusters of conversation, Eli appeared at her elbow. "Miss Weston," he said. She turned. He was holding his hat, as he always did, turning the brim between his fingers. In the bright Sunday light, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that came from years of squinting against prairie sun, and a small scar along his jaw that she hadn't noticed before. "Mr. Calloway," she said, and kept her voice pleasantly neutral in a way that cost her some effort. "Nice morning," he said. "It is." She waited. He seemed to be constructing something in his mind, choosing each word with the careful deliberation of a man laying foundation stones. "I saw you," he said finally. "At the creek a few weeks back." "I know you did," she said. "You waved." He nodded slowly. "I wanted to come across to talk." He paused. "But I had the men there, and the work was at a particular point that needed attention." She looked at him, at the honest trouble in his expression, the way he wasn't making excuses but simply explaining as plainly as he could manage, and felt the last bit of her carefully constructed indifference begin to dissolve. "What are you building out there?" she asked. Something crossed his face that she could not name. His jaw tightened slightly, and he looked away toward the horizon for a moment before looking back. "A house," he said, "a proper house. For what purpose?" He met her eyes fully then, and the warmth in that look was so clear and unguarded that it went through her like a struck chord. "I've been thinking about that," he said quietly, "for a while now." He put his hat on. "I hope you'll come to the 4th of July gathering, Miss Weston. I'll be there." And then he excused himself and walked to his horse and rode southeast, and Clara stood in the church sunlight with her heart making a complicated amount of noise. Nora materialized at her side approximately 4 seconds later. "I saw that conversation," Nora said. "Hush," Clara said, but she was smiling. "He stood there and talked to you for nearly 5 minutes. which I believe is a personal record for Eli Calloway in the post-service social context. He said he's building a house. Nora said nothing for a moment, and when Clara looked at her, Nora's expression was the particular kind of knowing that Clara was beginning to understand was Nora's version of great restraint. "Did he?" she said softly. "For a purpose," Clara added, and saying the words made the warmth spread further, and she pressed her hands together and breathed out slowly, because it was too large and too fragile yet to hold comfortably. The days leading up to the 4th of July were long and bright, and Clara was busy, genuinely busy, because me had taken on a large order for the Harrow Creek Independence celebration, and the store was stocked with fireworks powder, bunting fabric, and an unfortunate quantity of ribbon in red, white, and blue that had become her particular organizational nightmare. She worked hard, and it helped. It kept the expectation from building to a pressure she couldn't contain. But in the evenings she allowed herself to think about it, not with the anxious turning over she'd been doing before, but with something gentler and more open. A house, he had said, a proper house. For a purpose he had been thinking about for a while. She turned those words over carefully, the way you turn something delicate in your hands to understand its shape, and each time they came out sounding the same, sounding like something she very much wanted to be true. She also, in this period, learned more about Eli Calloway in the informal way of small towns where information travels freely if you simply listen. She learned that he had come west from Missouri as a young man of 18, after his family's farm had failed in the economic difficulties following the war. He had worked for 3 years as a ranch hand on the Porter property, sleeping in a bunkhouse and saving every penny before buying his own land. He had built his first structure on that land himself, a single-room cabin, with his own hands and the help of 2 neighbors. He had since expanded his herd to a respectable size, and his reputation among the cattlemen of the county was that of a man whose word was absolute, whose horses were always sound, and whose fences never needed mending twice. She learned that he had been briefly engaged, years ago, to a girl from the neighboring county who had ultimately chosen a man from back east and a life in a city, and that Eli had taken this loss quietly and buried it in work, as he buried most things. She learned from me, who had watched more of Harrow Creek's life pass through her store than anyone, that Eli was the sort of man who loved deeply and infrequently, and that when he decided on something, he pursued it with the patient, absolute certainty of water cutting through stone. "He's been working on that house since the 3rd week after you arrived," me told her one evening, and the number struck Clara silent. The 3rd week. Before she had even properly learned the creek path, before she had attended her first dance, or reorganized the storeroom, or begun to understand the rhythm of this place she was building into a home. He had looked at her across a store counter, and something had moved in him, and he had gone home and begun to build. Clara sat with this knowledge for a long time, and what she felt was not the flattery of being found attractive, but something larger and quieter than that. The weight of being genuinely seen. Of someone deciding, in that deliberate stone-cutting way of his, that she was worth preparing for. The 4th of July arrived with a sky so blue it hurt, and a heat that settled over Harrow Creek like a friendly hand. The main street had been hung with bunting, and the smell of food cooking drifted from the church grounds, where long tables had been set under a canvas awning, and most of the town's women had contributed something to the spread. There were pies and cornbread and roasted corn, and a great fragrant pot of beef stew that Mrs. Reverend Marsh had been tending since dawn. The blacksmith had arranged a horseshoe game in the side lot, and there was a fiddler setting up near the church steps, and children were running between adult legs like small determined fish through a current. Clara wore her blue dress again, the one with the ivory trim, because she was not above making deliberate choices about such things. She saw Eli the moment he arrived, because she had been watching the South Road with an attention she was no longer troubling to hide from herself. He came in on his roan horse, which he tied at the livery, and he was wearing a clean white shirt and a dark vest, and he had clearly made some effort with his hair. He stood for a moment, scanning the gathering, and when his eyes found her, he didn't look away. He started walking toward her directly, with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows exactly where he's going and has thought carefully about what he'll say when he gets there. "Miss Weston," he said, and his voice was quiet in the festival noise around them. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I'm glad you came." "I told you I would," he said simply, as though the idea that he might not had never occurred to him. They ate together at one of the long tables, with Nora and Tom on one side and me on the other, and the conversation was easy and wide and touched on everything from me's opinion of the quality of this year's peach crop to Tom's account of the most recent excitement in town, which had involved a traveling salesman, a disputed card game, and a donkey, the specific role of which Tom was still not entirely clear on. Eli spoke more than Clara had heard him speak in all their previous encounters combined, not volubly, not effusively, but steadily, in that low, deliberate voice, and what he said was always worth hearing. When the fiddler started up and couples began moving to the cleared space near the church steps, Tom pulled Nora to her feet with the ease of long practice, and me gave Clara and Eli the same look she had been giving them for weeks, serene and unsurprised, and found somewhere else to be. Eli looked at Clara. His hat was off, held in his hands as always, and there was a quality in his expression that she had come to recognize as his version of vulnerability, the way he let something through that he usually kept quiet. "I'm not a fine dancer," he said. "Neither am I," Clara said, which was not entirely true but seemed like the right thing to say. He set his hat on the bench and offered his hand, and she took it, and they moved out to the dance. He was actually a decent dancer, careful and steady, the same qualities he brought to everything. She was a better dancer than she'd claimed, and the small harmless deception made her laugh, and when she laughed he smiled, a full genuine smile that transformed his face in a way that did considerable damage to her composure. She had not seen that smile before. It was clearly not deployed often, and it was, she thought a little breathlessly, one of the finest things she had encountered west of the Mississippi. They danced twice, which was enough for the whole town to notice and for Nora to be visibly triumphant from across the square. Afterward, when the light was going amber and long, they walked to the edge of the gathering where the noise softened and the creek path began, and they stood in the cooling air while the celebration continued behind them. "I'd like to show you something," Eli said. "Not tonight. Another day when it's ready, if you'd be willing." She looked at him, at the careful hope in his face, and felt something open in her chest like a window in spring. "What is it?" He was quiet for a moment. "The house," he said, "when it's finished." She understood fully and finally what he had been doing all those weeks. All those mornings she had stood at the creek listening to the hammering and feeling the confused ache of his absence. He had not been absent. He had been building. He had been constructing, board by board and nail by nail, with his own 2 hands and the labor of trusted friends, a place where he hoped a life might be lived. "I'd be very willing," she said softly. He nodded. He looked down at his hands and then back at her, and the next thing he said clearly cost him something to say, but he said it anyway in that steady, unhurried way of his. "I haven't been good at saying things, Miss Weston. I know that. I know you may have thought," he paused. "I just want you to know that every day I've been working on that property, I've been thinking about the kind of life that would be worthy of asking someone to share. And when I ask, I want to be ready to ask right." The fiddler was playing something sweet and slow behind them. The fireflies were beginning in the grass. The sky above the plains was doing that particular western thing where the colors seemed excessive and somehow exactly right. Clara Weston, who had crossed half a continent on her own and rebuilt a life from the ground up and never once waited for someone else to make things happen, felt the deep peace of having arrived somewhere she hadn't known she was heading. "Eli," she said, because she was done with formalities, at least in this moment and in this light, "I think you've been doing everything right from the start." He looked at her for a long, still moment, and then he did something that surprised her. He reached out very carefully and took her hand, the same way he'd taken it for the dance, and he held it without saying anything else. And they stood like that while the celebration continued behind them and the stars began to come out over the Texas plains. Summer deepened, and with it, the thing between Clara and Eli grew at its own particular pace, which was to say, steady, rooted, unhurried, but unmistakable. He began coming into the store again with his previous regularity, and he often stayed to talk with Clara when me found convenient reasons to be occupied elsewhere, which she did with increasing frequency and considerable efficiency. They talked about everything. Clara was surprised by the breadth and depth of what moved through Eli's mind. He had not had much formal schooling, but he read, and he thought carefully about what he read, and his understanding of the land he worked was both practical and almost reverent. He knew the name of every grass species on his property and their relative value for grazing. He knew the water table, the seasonal flood patterns of the creek, the way the wind shifted in different months. He talked about these things with a quiet passion that was like watching a normally still surface develop depth and current. She told him about Memphis, about her parents, about the boarding house and the ledger books and the slow erosion of the life she'd known. She told him about the decision to come west, the train and then the stage, the way the landscape had changed until she couldn't have said where exactly she had crossed from the familiar world into something entirely different, and entirely, she now understood what she had been looking for. "Were you frightened?" he asked. "Constantly," she said. "But less frightened of going than of staying." He nodded slowly, in the way he had that meant he understood something deeply. "That's how it was for me, coming out here from Missouri. Every day I thought I might have made a terrible mistake, and then I'd see something, the sunset or the way the grass moved or just the fact that this was mine, I'd built it, and I'd think, no, this is exactly right." "Do you still think that?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "More than ever," he said. One afternoon in late July, he came to the store with an expression that was different from usual, brighter and slightly nervous, which on Eli's controlled face was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had been paying the close attention Clara had been paying. "It's done," he said. She looked up from her ledger. "The house?" "The house." He held the brim of his hat. "I thought, if you'd like to see it, tomorrow maybe, I could bring a wagon to town." Clara felt her pulse do something it had no business doing in the middle of a perfectly ordinary mercantile. "Tomorrow," she said. "Yes." Me looked up from her shelves with the expression of a woman who is pleased with the way the world is ordering itself and has been waiting some time for this particular development. He arrived the next morning with a clean buckboard and 2 good horses, and me physically shooed Clara out the door with the words, "The accounts will be here when you get back," and the strong implication that Clara's continued presence in the store was unnecessary and somewhat in the way. The drive southeast along the creek road was easy and warm. The summer grass was high on either side, golden and moving. They talked as they drove, not about anything of great consequence, about the horses and the weather and a red-tailed hawk that crossed the road ahead of them, and the ease of it was something Clara held on to, the way ordinary things became precious when they were shared with the right person. The land opened up as they turned east off the main road, following a new wheel track through the grass that hadn't been there when Clara had first arrived. The creek was visible to the left, winding through its cottonwood corridor. And then, rising from the flat ground against a backdrop of sky and grass, she saw the house. It was not grand. She would not have wanted grand, not out here, where the landscape already provided all the grandeur required. It was a proper frame house, 2 stories, with a covered porch running the full width of the front face. The wood was pale and fresh, still showing the cream color of new-cut timber. The windows were real glass, which she knew cost money and trouble to bring out here, and they caught the morning light and threw it back with warmth. There was a stone chimney at each end, built from the creek limestone that she had admired in the bluffs since her first week in Harrow Creek. A kitchen garden had been staked out beside the house, the earth freshly turned and waiting. She was very still for a moment, and then she realized she was pressing one hand against her own heart, which was, she thought, slightly excessive but entirely justified. Eli helped her down from the buckboard and she walked toward the house slowly, taking in every detail. The porch boards were smooth and even. The door had been hung straight and true. There was a bench beside the door, hand-carved, with a simple scrollwork pattern along the back that she recognized as similar to the ironwork Mee had on her store counter. "You made that bench," she said. "Winters are long," he said, with a slight self-consciousness that charmed her unreasonably. Inside, the rooms were clean-smelling of new wood and linseed oil. The main room was generous, with the south-facing window looking out over the grass toward the creek. There was a stone fireplace, well-built and solid, and two small bedroom doors opening off the main room, and a kitchen in the back with a cast-iron stove and shelving that had been built with the same careful attention as everything else. Upstairs, two more rooms, and from the east-facing window she could see the whole sweep of the property, the grass and the creek and the cattle grazing in the distance, and the ribbon of road that led back to Harrow Creek, not so far away that you'd feel cut off from the world, and not so close that the world was always at your door. She stood at that window for a long moment. Eli was at the doorway of the room, watching her, and when she turned, his expression was everything she had hoped for and been afraid to count on. Open, hoping, terrified in the way of a man who has built everything he knows how to build and knows the rest is not in his hands. "Eli," she said softly. "I know," he said, "that I am not a man of many words. I know that I disappeared for weeks at a stretch while I was working on this and I never explained it properly, and you had every right to think what you might have thought." "I thought you were ignoring me," she admitted. He took a slow breath. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. I should have said something sooner. He looked down at his hat and then back up. "I wanted to be able to show you something worth saying. I didn't want to tell you what I felt and have nothing behind it. I wanted you to be able to see it, to know that I meant it enough to build it before I even knew if you'd say yes." Clara crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the pulse in his throat, the slight tension in his jaw. "Say what?" she asked quietly, though she knew. She wanted to hear it. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than usual, rough at the edges. "That I love you, Clara Weston. That I have loved you since you walked into Me's store with your carpet bag and your ledger books and looked at my grocery list like you were thinking about reorganizing it. And that I built this house because I wanted to ask you to share it with me, all of it, the work and the seasons and the whole long life of it, if you'll have me." She reached up and put both her hands on his face and felt him go very still and said, "I have been in love with you since you said in response to my question about spring, and I somehow found it charming instead of maddening, which I think tells you everything you need to know about how far gone I already was." He let out a breath that seemed to release something he'd been holding for a long time, and then he was kissing her, careful at first and then not careful at all, and outside the east window the Texas sky went on forever in every direction, and the grass moved in the summer wind, and the cattle grazed peacefully in the meadow that would be theirs. They were engaged by August. Clara gave me the news on a Monday morning, and Mee put down her broom and hugged her with a warmth that Clara had not expected from Mee's characteristically brisk exterior, and then immediately began making practical observations about the advantages of a church wedding in September before the weather turned. Nora, upon hearing the news, made a sound that the entire south side of Harrow Creek probably heard, and then made a very long speech that was essentially one extended version of "I knew it. I knew it from the very first week." Tom Hensley shook Eli's hand and said, "She'll keep you honest," which Eli received as the compliment it was intended to be. There was a small difficulty in September, the kind that tests the foundations of things. A man named Vance Holloway arrived in Harrow Creek with a deed he claimed gave him rights to the eastern portion of Eli's land, including the creek frontage. Holloway was the sort of man who seemed to fill rooms with something unpleasant even when he wasn't saying anything. a broad, florid-faced man with the expensive boots and cheap eyes of someone who had acquired his money through means that didn't survive close examination. He had bought the old Porter deed from the estate, he said, and there was an old boundary dispute that had never been legally resolved, and he had a lawyer from Austin who wrote very official-looking letters. Eli received this news in his characteristic manner, which was to say, quietly, with his face very still and his jaw very tight. He rode to the county seat and spent 3 days with the county land records. He wrote letters of his own. He was gone from Harrow Creek during this period, and Clara knew enough now to understand that his absence was not indifference but intention, that this was how he handled things that needed handling, and she felt none of the old hurt. She felt instead a steady confidence in him, in his method, in the careful, deliberate way he put one foot in front of the other. She also wrote 2 letters herself, one to a solicitor in Memphis whose brother, she had learned through correspondence, was now working law in Austin. The second to the state land office, requesting records that Eli had not thought to request, related to the original survey of the creek boundary. When Eli returned from the county seat, Clara laid both sets of information on the table, her records alongside his. The original survey, it turned out, contained a notation that the boundary had already been adjudicated in 1871 and concluded in the original purchaser's favor, a conclusion that specifically applied to any subsequent sale of the Porter estate. Holloway's claim had no legal foundation whatsoever. His lawyer, presented with this information 2 weeks later, found pressing business elsewhere. Holloway departed Harrow Creek without ceremony and to no great sorrow. Eli looked at the documents Clara had assembled for a long moment, then looked at her. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she corrected. The look he gave her then was different from any he had given her before. It was not the careful, hoping look of the man at the window. It was something settled and deep, something like the way a foundation stone looks when it has been set exactly right, and you know it will hold everything that's built above it. "Lord," he said quietly, with the faint beginnings of that rare transformative smile, "I really did build the right house." They were married on the first Saturday of October, 1879, in the small whitewashed church with the board-colored walls, and it had been repainted for the occasion by a committee of church women including me, who had somehow organized the whole effort in 4 days and made it look effortless. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold, and the air had that sharp, clean sweetness of early autumn on the plains. Clara wore a dress that she and Nora had made together over several evenings, ivory with small blue flowers that Nora had embroidered with more artistry than Clara had known Nora possessed, and Eli wore his good dark suit that he had pressed himself and a white shirt that he'd had to iron twice, according to Tom, who seemed to find this endearing. The Reverend said the words, and Clara and Eli said their words back to him, and when it was done and Eli kissed her in front of half of Harrow Creek, there was a sound that started in the front pew where Nora was sitting and spread through the whole small building like water finding its level. Afterward, there was a celebration at the church grounds that lasted well into the evening, and the fiddler who had played at the 4th of July gathering was there again, and Clara and Eli danced, and this time nobody was pretending to be a worse dancer than they were, and it was therefore somewhat more impressive, and Nora commented on this with great satisfaction. When the celebration finally wound down, and the stars were thick above the plains, and the last wagon had gone rattling homeward, Clara and Eli drove south along the creek road to the house he had built, and it was lit from within by the lamps he had left burning, and it looked exactly the way a home should look against the dark Texas sky. They settled into the life of it with the ease of 2 people who have been building toward the same thing from different directions, and are relieved and glad to have finally arrived. Clara continued working at me's store for the first months, because the accounts were genuinely a 2-person job, and because she valued the connection to the town and to me, who was becoming something between a mentor and a grandmother to her. Eli worked his land, his cattle, his fences and water sources, and the 1,000 daily requirements of a working ranch in the Texas plains. But they worked together too, in the ways that mattered most. Clara took over the financial records of the ranch, bringing the same methodical precision to the cattle accounts that she'd brought to Me's ledgers, and within a season she had identified 3 areas where Eli had been losing money through inefficiency and 2 opportunities for profit he hadn't seen. Eli listened to her analysis with complete seriousness, asked careful questions, and implemented every change she suggested. The results were visible by the following spring. He taught her to ride properly, which she had been managing on a basic level but without the confidence the open country required. He was a good teacher, patient and precise, and she learned with the same quick determination she brought to everything. And within 3 months she was riding out with him on the early morning checks of the cattle and the fence lines, which was the hour she came to love best, the world pale and fresh and entirely theirs. She taught him to read a balance sheet, which he approached with the focused seriousness of a man learning a new kind of territory, and to write formal letters that said what he meant without sacrificing his natural directness. She taught him to make bread because she loved the smell of it and the work of it, and because one long winter evening she looked at him with flour on his hands and thought she had never seen anything so right in her life. The winter of their first year was hard, as winters on the Texas plains often were, with a blue norther that came through in January and pushed temperatures to depths that kept them both close to the house for 2 weeks. They had prepared well. The storeroom was full, the livestock were in. They spent the long, cold days in that particular intimate closeness of 2 people, learning each other's interior landscape as thoroughly as they had learned each other's faces. She learned that he woke before dawn and was incapable of lying in bed past first light, and that he read by lamplight before getting up, holding the book in both hands with intense absorption. She learned that he had a dry humor that surfaced unexpectedly and was funnier for being rare. She learned that he was deeply good, in the uncomplicated way of people who have thought carefully about what they believe and live accordingly, and that this goodness was not passive but active, the kind that noticed things and did something about them. He learned that she sang when she was working, not loudly, not for performance, just small snatches of songs she half remembered from her mother, and that she did it unconsciously and would stop if she thought anyone was listening. He learned very quickly to give no indication that he could hear her, because the singing made the house feel like something he hadn't had a word for before and now couldn't imagine being without. He learned that she had a temper, brief and honest and nothing like malice, that burned up quickly and left no residue. He learned that her mind moved fast in ways that could leave him a sentence behind sometimes, and that this was not impatience but enthusiasm, and that she waited for him always, because the point was never to be fast but to arrive together. By the spring of their first year of marriage, Clara knew she was expecting a child, and she told Eli on a morning in April when the grass was just beginning to come back green and the creek was running with the fullness of snowmelt. He was very still for a long moment. Then he took her face in both hands and looked at her in a way that she would remember every day for the rest of her life, with a joy so large it had clearly taken him completely by surprise, as though he had prepared himself for all the practical aspects of this possibility and had still been entirely unprepared for what it would feel like when it arrived. "Clara," he said, and that was all, just her name, but she understood everything in it. "I know," she said, and put her hands over his. "They told me first, because me was in many ways the center of whatever community they both belonged to. Me received the news with the dry warmth that was her particular mode and said, 'Well, I suppose that storeroom we've been meaning to reorganize will have to wait,' and then made tea and talked for 2 hours about practical preparations, with an expertise that revealed she had been thinking about this eventuality for some time. They told Nora and Tom, and Nora's response involved such sustained volume that the horses in the nearby paddock briefly expressed concern. The child was born in November of 1880, in the house Eli had built, in the bedroom with the east-facing window that looked out over the grass and the creek. He was a boy, strong and loud from the first moment, with his father's dark hair and his mother's particular expression of someone who intends to understand everything about the situation they've arrived in. They named him James William Calloway, for Eli's father and Clara's grandfather respectively, and the naming felt like a joining of lines that had run parallel for long years before finding their confluence. Eli held his son in the first hours with the same quality of focused stillness he brought to things that mattered most to him, and the look on his face was something Clara could not have described and knew she did not need to, because it was the kind of thing that lives beyond description, in the territory of pure experience. James was a vigorous, curious, loud-opinioned child who seemed from the earliest age to have inherited both his father's physical ease in the outdoors and his mother's relentless need to understand how things worked. He was walking at 10 months and was an exhausting and magnificent problem from that point forward. He learned to ride almost before he could reliably navigate stairs. He could identify 12 species of grasses by the time he was 3, because his father had taught him carefully, and because he paid absolute attention to everything his father did. Clara watched Eli parent their son with the same quality of quiet, deliberate love he brought to everything, patient and present and never careless with the boy's trust, and it was, if possible, an even deeper falling in love than the one that had happened in Me's store and on the creek path and in the house's east window. The ranch grew in these years. Eli added 20 acres to the east, buying from a neighboring family who was returning to Tennessee, and expanded the herd accordingly. They hired 2 hands, brothers named Augustin and Rodrigo Vasquez, whose family had been in this part of Texas for 3 generations before Texas was Texas, and who knew the land with an intimacy that Eli respected and learned from with characteristic thoroughness. Clara, at Eli's suggestion, negotiated their wages herself, which she did with both fairness and precision, and the result was a working arrangement built on mutual respect that sustained itself without drama. There was an ongoing and larger story moving through this country at the same time, one that Clara and Eli were both aware of and could not fully separate themselves from. The displacement of the Comanche and other tribes from this part of Texas was winding toward its terrible conclusion in these years. The people who had lived on these plains for generations were being pushed onto reservations through a combination of force and starvation. Clara had been raised in Memphis, far from the frontier, and the reality of it here was something she encountered not as abstraction, but as the human faces of families she occasionally saw in the town, people stripped of the life their families had built as surely as she had been stripped of hers, except that her stripping had been the neutral cruelty of economic misfortune rather than the deliberate violence of policy. She and Eli talked about it honestly, which was more than many of their neighbors did. He was not a man who pretended the ground his cattle grazed on had simply been empty. He was also not a man who knew what to do with a history that was still being made around him. What he could do and did was treat the people he encountered with full humanity, regardless of origin, and ensure that his land and his dealings carried no deliberate contribution to the harm being done. It was not enough. They both knew it was not enough, but it was what they had within their reach, and Clara came to understand that Eli's particular goodness was the kind that dealt honestly with what it couldn't fix, and that this honesty was its own form of moral courage. Harrow Creek itself was changing. The railroad had come through the county in 1881, not through Harrow Creek itself, but near enough that a spur line was proposed and generally expected within a few years. New families were arriving regularly, some from the east and south, and some from Mexico, and some from further abroad than that. The town was acquiring a second store, a doctor who was young and enthusiastic, and not entirely sure yet of everything he was doing but willing to learn, and a schoolhouse, the last of which Clara considered the most important development by a considerable margin. She was instrumental in establishing the school, in the way that instrumental is sometimes the wrong word for what is really essential. She attended the organizing meetings and brought the ledger she had already started of proposed costs and likely enrollment. She wrote to the state education office in Austin for guidelines on teacher certification. She tracked down a teacher in the form of a young woman named Dorothea Ames, who had come west from Ohio with a teaching certificate and a trunk of books, and was currently boarding with the Hensleys and beginning to wonder if she'd made a mistake. Clara convinced Dorothea that she had not made a mistake, presented her with the town's formal offer, and the Harrow Creek School opened in the autumn of 1882 with 14 enrolled pupils, one of whom was a not-quite 2-year-old James Calloway, who was too young to attend, but attended anyway because he had heard about it and had strong feelings on the subject. It was in 1883 that Clara found out she was expecting their second child, and this time the news came with a particular layer of complexity, because James had just turned 2 and was, as previously noted, an exhausting and magnificent problem. And the thought of doing all of this with 2 of them was both thrilling and briefly terrifying in equal measure. Eli received this news with the same transformed joy as the first, and then demonstrated the quality of his practical attention by immediately beginning to plan the expansion of the house, specifically the addition of 2 more bedrooms upstairs, which he framed over the course of that winter in the evenings and weekends, and finished in the early spring in time for the new arrival. The second child arrived in June of 1883, easier than James had been, or at least faster, which Clara considered a mercy. She was a girl, born into a summer morning of extraordinary clarity, with her mother's lighter hair and her father's deep, warm brown eyes, and they named her Eliza Calloway, the middle name being a straightforward acknowledgment of the woman without whose store and particular brand of pointed wisdom neither of her parents would have found their way to each other. Me cried when she heard the middle name, which she did privately and then firmly denied for the rest of her life. Eliza was entirely different from her brother. Where James was physical and loud and outdoor-bound from the beginning, Eliza was quiet and watchful and extraordinarily interested in things being done precisely. She sat for long periods organizing objects into careful arrangements. She learned to talk later than James, but with a completeness and accuracy that suggested she had been waiting until she had sufficient vocabulary to say exactly what she meant. She was her mother's particular joy and her father's particular wonder, and the way Eli looked at his daughter was something Clara had to occasionally look away from because it was too much tenderness for one gaze to contain. The house that Eli had built grew with their lives, the 2 extra upstairs rooms, a proper summer kitchen off the back, a root cellar, lined with stone, that Clara had requested on the grounds of practical winter planning, and that Eli built with the same careful craft he brought to everything. The kitchen garden became a substantial thing, producing more than they could use themselves, and providing a regular surplus that Clara traded at Me's store in an arrangement that suited everyone. The years moved as good years do, with enough difficulty to keep life honest and enough grace to make the difficulty bearable. There was a drought summer in 1884 that was genuinely frightening, when the grass burned brown by July, and the creek ran thin and Eli rode the fence lines, with the particular set to his jaw that Clara had learned meant he was keeping his worry contained for both their sakes. They made it through, the cattle reduced by 1/3 through sales they'd rather not have made, but the core of the herd intact, and the land in better condition than some of their neighbors because Eli had never grazed it past its capacity. Dorothea Ames turned out to be a teacher of genuine gift, and the Harrow Creek School became something the county noticed, and then the state education office noticed. And in 1885, a letter arrived asking if the school would serve as a model for regional education development, which resulted in a visit from 2 men from Austin who spent a day in town and spent most of it talking to Clara. who had by this point become the unofficial administrator of the school's organization and funding, alongside her management of the ranch accounts, and who described the school's model with the crisp precision of someone who had thought it through thoroughly from every angle. Eli rode into town the afternoon of the Austin men's visit and found Clara standing outside the school, talking to two men in city suits with the easy authority of someone completely at home in the conversation. He stood at a distance for a moment before she saw him, and the thing he felt watching her was a kind of gratitude so large it didn't have a comfortable place to live in an ordinary chest. He had built a house and asked a woman to share it. She had transformed everything the house contained, including him, into something better and more complete than he had known how to imagine. She saw him across the street and excused herself from the city men and came to him directly. "What are you smiling at?" she asked, looking up at him with that quick, direct regard he would never in his life tire of. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him, reading him as she always could. "Eli Calloway," she said, "you are the worst liar I have ever met." "I know," he said, still smiling. She shook her head, but she was smiling too, and she took his hand right there on the main street of Harrow Creek with the city men watching and the school children coming out for their afternoon break and said, "Come home. James has been asking for you all day, and Eliza has reorganized the storeroom again, and I think she may have actually improved it, but I can't find the cornmeal." He laughed, full and warm. The laugh she had spent weeks in Me's store trying to coax out of him before she understood that it was there and waiting. It just needed time and the right conditions to surface. He tucked her hand more firmly into his arm, and they walked to where his horse was tied. And she took the front of the saddle, and he swung up behind her as he often did when they were going the same direction. And they rode home along the creek road in the afternoon light, while the cottonwoods threw their shadows long and gold across the water. Me sold her store in 1886, at the age of 64, to a young couple from San Antonio named the Garcias, who were, as she informed the whole town with characteristic directness, perfectly capable people who were going to do a fine job. She moved into the small house she owned 2 streets back from the main road, and established herself as the primary social institution of Harrow Creek, receiving visitors with the regularity of a schedule and the precision of a post office. Clara visited her every Thursday without exception, and they would sit in Me's front room with coffee and discuss everything from the school accounts to the national political situation with equal energy and interest. It was Me who told Clara, in the winter of 1887, that she had been watching Harrow Creek for 30 years, and that it had never had anything to be quite so proud of as what Clara and Eli had built. And she said it with the plain simplicity of someone stating a fact. And Clara put her coffee down and pressed her hands against her face for a moment, because the words went through her like music. She was expecting their 3rd child at this point, which she and Eli had received with the specific delight of parents who have been through it twice, and know what they're doing, and have been reminded that they love the newness of it regardless. James was 7 and Eliza 4, and their interactions with the news ranged from James's pragmatic assessment that they would need to re-examine the room assignments to Eliza's immediate request to know the baby's name, so she could begin referring to it correctly. Their 3rd child was born in the early hours of an April morning in 1888, another boy, arriving in the last of the night before the dawn came up gold and broad over the grass. They named him Samuel Cooper Calloway, Cooper for a family name of Clara's that she had wanted to use and hadn't yet found the right opportunity for. Sam was, from the beginning, the easiest of their children, possessed of a sunny, even temperament that seemed to have bypassed the drama available in his genealogy, and settled instead for a steady, warm cheerfulness that made every room he was in feel slightly better. Eli held Sam in the first morning light the way he had held each of their children, with that same overwhelming quality of presence, and Clara, watching from the bed with the specific exhaustion and exhilaration of having just delivered a person into the world, thought about a spring morning 9 years ago when she had stood at a creek bank listening to hammering and thought herself forgotten. He had not been ignoring her. He had been building her a home, not just the house, though the house was real and good and sound with the care that had been put into it. All of it. The life. The shared accounts and the morning rides and the bread made on winter evenings and the children's voices in the rooms upstairs and the way he still held her hand on the main street of Harrow Creek without self-consciousness, as though it had always been the most natural thing in the world. All of it built, deliberately and with patience, and the same quality of total commitment he brought to every fence and every stone and every word he chose to say. "Look at him," she said softly, meaning the baby but also perhaps all of it. Eli looked up from Sam and looked at her, and the warmth in his face was everything it had ever been and more besides, layered now with years and shared things, and the specific depth of people who have built something together that neither of them could have built alone. "We did pretty well," he said. She laughed at the understatement of it, tired and joyful and entirely at home. "We did pretty well," she agreed. By the time Sam was walking, and James was learning to handle a rope, and Eliza was reading with a speed that made Dorothea Ames write Clara a note expressing both delight and mild concern about the rate at which Eliza was working through the school's reading supply, the Calloway Ranch had become one of the settled, known things of the county's landscape, the kind of place that other people use as a landmark when giving directions. The house with the stone chimneys and the full-length porch, and the kitchen garden that Clara had expanded to run along the south side of the house, and that bloomed in season with both vegetables and the flowers she'd been gradually adding since the year after James was born. Nora and Tom's family had grown too, and the two families had the kind of easy, deep friendship that comes from growing up alongside each other in the specific way that frontier communities grew, through shared difficulties and celebrations, and the thousand small mutual reliances that accumulate into something unbreakable. Tom had become the full sheriff by this point, and Nora had somehow become the unofficial keeper of the town's collective memory, the person who remembered who had arrived when and what had happened and what the weather had been doing. And this was an extraordinary asset in a town that was otherwise not much given to record-keeping. Me turned 70 in 1892, and the town threw her a celebration that she attended with tremendous dignity, and then described privately to Clara as overdone, which was the most satisfied she had ever heard me sound. Clara was 35 by this point, and the morning she stood at the east window of the house and looked out over the land that was theirs, she did the calculation of it sometimes. 13 years from the woman who had stepped off a stage with a carpet bag and a letter of introduction. 7 children born in Harrow Creek in those years, between herself and Nora and the growing roster of families who had come through. 3 of them hers, growing in the rooms around her, becoming themselves in the particular accelerating way of children, who will not stay small regardless of how clearly you see the value of their smallness. Eli came up behind her at the window. He was 41, and the years had settled on him the way they settle on men who have worked hard and lived honestly, in the particular distinguished way of fine wood under weathering, the essential quality only more apparent. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked out the window with her over the land in the morning light. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I can see the whole place from here," she said. "Everything you built, everything we built." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you remember," he said, "that first time you came out here to see the house? I remember everything about that day. I was terrified," he said, "not of what you might say. I was fairly sure of what you'd say by then. I was terrified that I hadn't done it well enough, that I'd looked at you across a store counter and thought, here's someone worth everything I know how to do, and then spent months doing it, and what if it wasn't what you deserved?" She turned inside his arms to face him, looking up at him in the morning light. "Eli, I know," he said, with the slight self-deprecation of a man who has heard himself say too much. "Ancient history." "No," she said. "It's not ancient history. It's the whole story. That's the whole story of how we got here." She reached up and put her hand against his face, the way she had in this same house on a different morning years ago, and felt him lean into it slightly in the way he always did, that small, unconscious trusting. "You built this house before you even knew if I'd say yes. You built a whole future and trusted that it might be shared. That is not a thing a person forgets, Eli. That is not a thing a person should ever forget." He covered her hand with his, and they stood at the east window while the light moved across the grass, and the cattle moved in the meadow, and somewhere in the room below them 3 children were beginning to stir to morning, and the house that had been built in love held all of it with the solid, unhurried patience of good construction. James appeared at the bottom of the stairs a few minutes later, dark-haired and already full of opinions about the day, asking about the east fence and whether they could ride out to check it after breakfast. Sam came behind him, sunny and unhurried. Eliza, last and most composed, announced that she had been awake for an hour and had already read 30 pages, and could they please talk about getting more books ordered through the general store, because Dorothea had agreed that the current supply was inadequate to the demand Eliza was creating. Clara looked at Eli. Eli looked at Clara. "I'll write to the bookseller in Austin," Clara said. "I'll ride the east fence with you," Eli told James. "After breakfast," Clara said firmly, and went to the kitchen, and the house filled with the sounds of morning the way it always did, the voices and the footsteps and the stove coming to life, and outside the open kitchen window the birds in the cottonwoods along the creek, and the grass moving in the early wind, and the whole bright continuing world of it opening another day. She was making bread that evening, the regular Thursday bread that had become one of her fixed rituals, when she heard the door and Eli came in from the last check of the evening with the particular smell of horse and open air and the warmth of a man who has worked well in good company. And he stopped in the kitchen doorway and watched her work without saying anything, the way he did sometimes, and she knew without turning that he was there by the quality of the room. "You're watching me," she said. "I always watch you," he said, with the simple honesty that had always been his best quality. "I haven't gotten tired of it yet. You've been watching me for 13 years. 14 almost," he corrected, with the precision that came out when he was being precise about something that mattered. "I noticed you before you noticed me." She turned then, hands still dusted with flour, and looked at him across the kitchen that smelled of yeast and the last of the day's fire, and the dried herbs she'd hung from the beam in October. He was leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, with that quiet look of a man entirely at peace with where he is and what he has. "Tell me," she said, because she had heard this story before and she asked for it sometimes, the same way you ask for a song you love. "You walked in," he said, "with your bag. And you looked at me store like you were about to organize it, which you did within a week, and I thought," he shook his head slightly the way he did with things that were large, "I thought that one is going to matter. And then you barely spoke to me for a month," she said. "And then I built you a house," he said. "Yes," she said, warm and certain and entirely home. "You built me a house." Outside, the Texas night was wide and star-heavy, and the wind that came across the plains carried the smell of grass and distance, and the creek running in the dark below the cottonwoods. The lamp burned steady on the kitchen table. Upstairs, 3 children were sleeping in rooms that Eli had built with his hands, in a house that had been raised from bare ground before the woman who lived in it had even known it was meant for her. She had thought he was ignoring her. She had stood at the creek and heard the hammering and felt the hurt of it, the particular ache of caring about someone who seemed not to care back. But he had been building her a home. Every board and every stone and every careful joint and every nail driven true. Every morning he had risen before light and gone to that work with the knowledge that it might never be enough and the conviction that it was worth doing anyway, because she was worth the full effort of everything he knew how to give. And the home he had built held them, held all of them, the way a good home should. Solid and warm and made to last. Made of more than timber and limestone and iron. Made of the same material as the man who built it, patient and deep and true, and the woman who had stepped through its door with flour on her hands and her whole life rearranging itself around the understanding that here, finally, was where she was supposed to be. Clara went back to her bread. Eli crossed the kitchen and kissed her temple, flour and all, and went to tend the stove, and the evening settled around them like something blessed, like the end of a long ride home, like arriving, like everything they had always, both of them, without knowing it, been building toward.